I've got the very nice task of trying to put you to sleep after that big steak and the big salmon. My presentation is going to focus on 4 points. I will speak to you about the South African context. I will then describe to you the South African National Qualifications Framework, and then some of the lessons that we've learned over the last 15 years. What is nice about it is that this morning, the two presenters spoke about the theoretical constructs, and whether the NQF is a reforming one, whether it is a transformatory one, whether it's a one for communication. So I'm not going to bore you with that. However, I'm going to ask you a question and ask you what kind of NQF I'm describing, right? So if you're not awake, then I will ask you. So the first thing is talking about the context. When you look at the context in South Africa, and people spoke about that before lunch. In South Africa, we've got a beautiful country. And you would see that is a picture of Cape Town. And it is one of the most iconic things that you can see when you go into South Africa, because you've got this wonderful Table Mountain. Around the mountain live rich people. We've got quite a lot of film stars that live there, that bought land in Cape Town. But a few kilometers away, when you land at the airport, you need to drive past quite a lot of the informal settlements that is around. So the gap between rich and poor in South Africa is big. In fact, we've got the most unequal society on this planet. In addition to this, you also have people in rural areas, and 40% of South Africans live in the rural areas. Our unemployment rate, depending on who you speak to, is between 25 and 40%. And most of the unemployed is between young people, amongst the young, the youth, as it were. So in other words, we are, in a sense, ready for the South African spring. That's the context. Now, the question is, how did it get there? And I can tell you a story about a man who had 4 children. And the one child looked just like the father, the son, just looked just like the father. Father earned 20 pesos. Or shall I say, 20 pesos is fine. And what the father did, because the son looked just like himself, he gave the son 10 pesos. And then the second child looked a little bit like him, not as much as the first one, so he gave that second one 5 pesos. And then the third one looked a little bit like the mother. So that one he gave 3 pesos to. And the last one looked like the mother-in-law. And he gave that one 2 pesos. And that happened over a long period in time. And then what happened was, the 2 younger children took the father to the equality court and said, "You can't do this to me. You can't do this to us." And so the father needed to now work out how will he make sure that everyone, is treated in an equitable way. So what do you think, how can the father do that? So in a sense, what I'm saying, the key question is, if you take 20 pesos and you divide it equally amongst those children, those who have, it is not going to close the gap. It is not going to close the gap. So how do you do that? That is the serious question that we are faced with in South Africa. Because if you start taking things away from those who have traditionally, what they're going to do, they're going to run away. When their streets have got potholes and they can't go to the best places and so on, they're going to run away. They're going to come to Chile, they're going to go to Argentina, they're going to go to Australia, they're going to go to the UK and so on. That's the question. How do you address inequality so that people on the one scale, that they don't run away, but people at the bottom feel that the gap gets closed? That is the context, okay? I will ask you the question before you go out. If you look further, there's 53 million people in the country. The life expectancy is about 57 years. Previously, it was a little bit down, around about 50. And that was because of the influence of HIV/AIDS. But that, has been reversed now. I told you about the unemployment. Most people are young and they are black, below 24%. 48% of people in the country live below the poverty line. Those young people between 14 and 25, that is not in employment, not in education, and not in training, we're talking about 3.4 million. Now, if I compare South Africa with your GDP, it's about 4 billion US. I think you were about, in Chile is about 3 billion, 300 billion. Very good news, in fact, if one looks at the representation of women in South Africa, that we've got 45% of women are in parliament. I think in Chile you were about 15%. Huh? Is it more? Less? Less, okay. And then 17% HIV/AIDS positive infections. Now, if one talks about the graduate unemployment rate, if you have, let me just go back. If you have a degree, like a Bachelor of Arts or Bachelor of Science or anything like that, then the unemployment rate there is just 5%. When you have a non-degree or a tertiary qualification, like a diploma or a 2-year diploma and so on, the unemployment rate there is something like 16%. But this is the staggering point. That grade 12 is 12 years of schooling. If you look at 12 years of schooling and those less than 12 years of schooling, in fact, the combined unemployment rate there is 71%. Staggering stuff. Now, so that's the context. Let me briefly talk about national qualifications frameworks across the world. And I'll speak about what it is that we're trying to do and how the national qualifications framework is part of a set of policies that we're trying to deal with to see how do we create, how do we close the gap. And the reason why I'm showing this slide is this morning there was this wonderful video and so on that seems like national qualifications frameworks only happens in Europe. It's not the case. It's the wrong idea. Okay, so where is it? You will see there Australia, South Africa, and so on. All of those blue ones were what was called first generation NQFs. So we're part of the first groups of people. Okay, that's the blue ones. So you can see all over the world, people are thinking about this idea and are implementing it. But not only are we talking about national qualifications frameworks in one country, but we're also talking about regional qualification frameworks. So you would see in the SADC region, for example, the European one, the Caribbean one, and then there's one called the Transnational Qualifications Framework, where in fact small states in the Commonwealth, that is in Pacific, within the African continent, and so on, you would see that all of them are linked together, as it were. So this is a huge phenomenon. It's about over 140 countries in the world, that's moving towards this. These are regional initiatives. I'm not going to go into detail around that, but to just say that, it is happening. Let me talk about the NQF now in South Africa. Firstly, because I work at this organization, I must tell you about it, okay? This is our vision. It is a world-class national qualifications framework for South Africa. Now, thank you. I'm talking about a world-class one. You would remember I said that the challenge that we've got is to deal with this inequality at the same time as becoming the best in the world. Because when you play in the World Cup, people are not going to say, shame, in South Africa you had racism and you were kept out, by the white minority. When people are there and they compete with you on the field, you must be the best. So therefore the challenge that we face is to be the best, while at the same time dealing with the kind of issues that we need to deal with in the country. Our strategic focus for the next 5 years is to deal with the issue of articulation. Now, I must tell you that before lunch, the kind of issues that people have raised around technical education, about the productive sector, I've heard it all over the world. And people cry about that all the time. And unfortunately, people like us in the education sector, we don't listen to that. And the cries that people have don't reach our ears because, after a gathering like this, we go back and we do nothing about it. So the issues about articulation is quite important. Recognition of prior learning is also an important focus for us. And then, of course, as I said, one of the key things for us is for our staff to become the best in the world. So, it must be there. And then the other thing that we have done that is different from any other qualifications framework in the world, we have also said that a qualifications framework gives you what are the learning opportunities, as it were, but you need to link that and you need to match that with the work opportunities that exist. So that is the innovation. It's the only qualifications framework in the world that has linked those two things in that way. So what are the kinds of things that we do in my organization? We register qualifications and part qualifications. And we've got a framework, and I'll show it to you later on. We also evaluate foreign qualifications. So if somebody from Chile wants to come and work in South Africa, we evaluate the qualification. We look at the education system in Chile, and we then compare that with the South African qualification system. And we give you a certificate of evaluation to say, this is how you fit into our system. We verify South African qualifications. I must go under the lights so that I'm getting hot. Okay. We verify South African qualifications, and I'll also, because we register all the qualifications, and we've got a record of the qualifications of individuals in South Africa, we can say whether these qualifications are authentic or not. And it's quite an important thing, because I've shown you that, that there's a real struggle for people to get into employment and so on. So the conditions create a whole range of things for people not to, to try to get in. we've got the National Learners Record Database, and this is where all our data is kept, and I'll show you, some of that statistics. Now, the other thing that we do, I must go back into the line. The other thing that we do is our framework also allows us now to recognize professional bodies. And here I think it's quite important to say that the traditional professions are okay, so the lawyers, the doctors, the pharmacists, and so on. But we live in a world where new professions are coming up all the time. And it's quite important, particularly in a resource-constrained environment, that people must have confidence in the professional bodies because people get told all kinds of things. So we register professional bodies, and we've got a list to say to the people of South Africa, these ones you can trust. I'd spoken about the career advice, we do research, and then we take international partnerships and linking with people very seriously. So we've got a division that deals with that. And then we believe it's important to market and to advocate for a national qualifications framework and for the work that we do. We're also now thinking about that we need to coordinate the recognition of prior learning across the country because our law says that we must develop policy, but we are saying we must do a bit more than that. And so we're considering that. And also we are looking at what are alternative ways of access into our education. Okay. So that is something about my organization. Just quickly, to give you a sense of it, I think previously one of the people said it's impossible here in Chile to have these things because it's a big country. It's not as small as Ireland. Let us talk a little bit. 53 million people. I think in Chile you are, 17 million? 16, 17 million? Sorry? So, South Africa is big if I compare it with you, okay? We've got 19,000 accredited providers. We've got 55 recognized professional bodies now. There are 212 professional designations, and we have loaded on our database 23,000 professionals, but we will also increase that as we go further. We're in the process of doing that now. We've got 11.8 million learner qualification achievements on our database. There are more than 70 million part qualifications that is achieved, that we've got records of. There are 9,900 qualifications recognized and 11,000 part qualifications. Okay? It can be done. Okay, we've got the same problem as yesterday. Through our helpline, we have reached 2.4 million people through the helpline, through radio programs and a whole number of that. I'm not going to go into detail about it. Now, what is the system that we are talking about? You heard David this morning say that you get a comprehensive national qualifications framework. A comprehensive one means that the whole system, you look after that. It is not only focused on higher education. So you would see in basic education, we've got 24,000 public schools, 1,200 private schools. Then there are early childhood centers, and this is a national literacy project where we have in the region of 600,000 people, adults, that come and they go through the process. Then we've got colleges. We've got 50 public colleges. And we also have got private colleges and adult learning centers. Then there are 23 public universities, and there are 108 private higher education institutions. We don't use the word university very lightly in South Africa. Most public institutions, we don't call universities, we call them institutions. Because in general, we are saying university must be a place that has got all the various kinds of disciplines and so on. And it must be big and so on. It can't just be a body that focuses on one, like business training, for example, or just would deal with professional development. It must, give the full Monty, as they say. And then you would see we've got professional bodies. This is how our framework looks like. Now, when we started out, our framework was one, and we had 8 levels and so on. And then there was changes that happened in 2008, where the framework changed. And so now our NQF is an NQF that consists of 3 sub-frameworks. And I'm also happy that David then started speaking about sub-frameworks. The 3 sub-frameworks, firstly, this blue part, it is level 1 to 4 on our NQF. It's a 10-level NQF. And that deals with general and further education. Then we've got level 5 to 10, and that is where the higher education sector is based. And then we've got on the green side here, it is called the occupational qualification sub-framework. So we've got 3 sub-frameworks: occupational, general and further, and higher. And you would see the qualifications, are listed on there. At the moment, our occupational qualifications framework starts at level 1, it goes to level 8. We don't have qualifications on that yet. And we've got a specific definition for what the occupational qualification is. It must have 3 components to it: a theoretical component, a practical component, and a workplace-based component. Okay, you happy? I can move on. Right. So the South African NQF then is a single integrated system which comprises 3 coordinated qualification sub-frameworks, and I'd spoken about that. And this was promulgated in December 2014. So what are the objectives of the NQF? It is about integration, and we try to integrate the sub-frameworks. It's about giving people access, giving them mobility and progression. Because if somebody starts, for example, here, the person must have the possibility of moving upwards, and also the person must have the possibility to, go across the sub-frameworks. And if the person starts here, they must have the possibility of going there. Now, saying it is easy. Doing it is a whole new thing. And speaking to people in universities and speaking to people, educationists like me, it's very difficult if you come from a technical and vocational side. It seems like there's difficulties in understanding and there's difficulties there, so we need to work together to try and deal with that. But can I just say, the other point about articulation for us, given the high unemployment rate, is also to make sure that there's a kind of matching between what it is that is needed in the economy, and the skills that people have. Quality, and then in South Africa, redress is a big issue because the past that we're coming from, which is, a racially or a racist and a sexist society that we come from. So the purpose then, it is addressing social justice issues, as I've said. It's about improving access, international benchmarking, and it's also about communication because, people must understand what this stuff is about. And it's about regulation. Now, I should also just say, as a way of background, we had something like 17 different departments of education in 1994. And so what the NQF has done is to put all of those qualifications onto one framework. We had a separate training sector, and so the job of the qualifications framework was to bring all of those qualifications together, so that they could have, kind of parity of esteem. So they're on one framework at least, And so, but the big challenge is how do you make the changes on the ground, as it were. That's the big challenge. Okay. Now, a little bit of a history here. In 1995, one of the first acts that the Parliament promulgated was the SAQA Act of 1995. And then, because there was quite a lot of resistance, in fact, because the act was passed, and so invariably there were people that felt very uneasy about the NQF. And so there was a study team that was set up, and they then developed a different set of documents. But eventually in 2007, the two ministers, we had a Minister of Education and a Minister of Labor. They then got together and developed a document which is called the Joint Policy Statement between Labor and Education. That ended the review of the NQF, and it then culminated in the NQF Act of 2008. Now, when you look at all of these, you would also see, and I think you've got an election coming, that when politicians come in, the politicians would like to make some changes, because people want to say that I was responsible for this and for that and so on. And even if people are from the same party, you have that phenomenon. So this was a minister that introduced the NQF Act, was one minister. In 2002, it was another minister. And that minister reviewed everything. The ministers that developed the joint policy statement that led to the act was another minister. And then in 2009, we had new elections, and that minister also then developed a new thing. But this was the key thing, and I think I'll speak about that also under lessons, is that in the document it spoke about, and in the act it spoke about the integration of education and training. But then what happened, the politicians then decided that Labor, the Department of Labor, the Ministry of Labor will have training under their wing, and education will be separate. But when you speak about integration and you have those separate things, it is very difficult to bring it together. So by the time in 2009, the ruling party was now sick and tired of these ministers fighting amongst each other. So what they did was they created one single department of higher education and training, and they moved training from Labor back, and so that you have one department. And so the key responsibility of the Minister of Higher Education and Training is to make sure that you have a post-school system that articulates. And that has been the single message that minister has been driving for the last 4 years. An articulated post-school system that must work together. And there should be no dead ends. He was saying consistently, I was in a meeting with him last week, and he said the same thing. So the minister then developed the green paper, and so we got the sub-frameworks that I'd shown you earlier promulgated, and so this is meant to take us forward. If one looks at governance, I said earlier that the NQF was the responsibility of the Minister of Education with the Minister of Labor. That has gone, and so it's just one minister responsible, the Minister of Higher Education and Training. Then we've got 3 quality councils, and I showed you that. General education, the Council on Higher Education that deals with higher education, and then the Quality Council that deals with trades and occupations. So this is the 4 bodies that is responsible for the implementation of the NQF in South Africa. Now, we have got linkages to what is called the National Skills Authority that is meant to work on skills, and they work with bodies within each of the different economic sectors called sector education and training authorities. They are responsible for planning skills in their particular sector. And then we have statutory and non-statutory professional bodies. So, and one of the reasons why I'm leaving early tomorrow and I'm not staying on is because I chair, this, we call it the NQF Forum, where all these bodies come together and we talk about what are the common issues to try to bring about the integration that we are speaking about. So what is our regulatory framework then? We've got the South African Constitution that allows for both private as well as public institutions to function within the country. So the NQF Act, we've got the Skills Development Act, the Higher Education Act, and the General Education, Further Education and Quality Assurance Act. So all of these work together, to bring together the NQF. We've got all of these policies and stuff like that. And you would see that we've got a policy on recognition of prior learning, one on assessment, one on credit accumulation and transfer. Also policies on qualifications, how it should look like. We've got a set of level descriptors. And then we've got policy and criteria for professional bodies. So, and then, because we had, these difficulties with how do you deal with conflict between different bodies, we even have what we call an NQF system of collaboration. And if it doesn't work, we also have a dispute resolution regulation. Okay, that clearly spells out what you need to do if there's a dispute and how one needs to deal with that. I wanted to briefly just talk a little bit about the Council on Higher Education and the issues with regard to accreditation and quality assurance. Our Council on Higher Education is responsible for quality assurance in higher education. And they've set up a permanent subcommittee that deals with higher education. It is called the Higher Education Quality Committee. And they promote quality assurance in higher education. They audit and quality assure institutions of education. They also accredit the programs in higher education. So that is what our council does. This outlines our different roles. Firstly, SAQA is responsible for overseeing the whole framework. But all of us must work we must develop a transparent, quality, internationally comparable NQF. And then the Council on Higher Education must make sure that they develop and manage their sub-framework. They also develop qualifications, and we register the qualifications on the side. In terms of quality assurance, we've got an overall monitoring function, and we also coordinate the three sub-frameworks so that they can talk to each other. And from time to time, we do impact studies. What we do jointly, we ensure integrity and credibility and collaborate on research projects and other studies. And then the quality councils, the CHE, has got the executive quality assurance function, and they ensure that quality assurance is undertaken in their specific sub-frameworks. Now, there are three ways in which the council does its work. It does, let me start here with institutional audits. And these institutional audits are there to make sure that the institution functions properly and that they can do what it is that they set out to do. But also they also accredit the different programs that the institutions apply to do. So they do this, they then accredit the institutions. Once they are sure that they can actually perform the function in terms of the institutional criteria. And then they also do national reviews. So for example, to make sure that across the system that you don't have standards drift. They would, for example, look at teacher education qualifications and look across the system to see how that is working. Or they would also do a recent one. They looked at MBAs and the quality of Masters of Business Administration across the system, looking both at public institutions and private institutions. And in fact, after they've done that exercise, there were quite a number of business schools whose MBAs was de-accredited because it didn't meet the quality criteria across the system. So, the underlying objective then of the quality, the Higher Education Quality Council that is part of the CHE is to ensure that institutions effectively and efficiently deliver education, training, research, and community service of high quality, which produce socially useful and enriching knowledge, as well as relevant range of graduate skills and competencies necessary for social and economic progress. So, as I said, this is the national reviews. The reaccreditation is carried out using specific criteria developed by specialists and peers and commented on by stakeholders and institutions offering the programs. The first cycle that was done of these was between 2004 and 2011. Institutional audits I'd spoken about. Let me just briefly then talk about key lessons. Firstly, the importance of coherent and systemic NQF implementation and the slow nature of educational transformation is quite an important issue. This is quite an important issue. So, so to put systems and structures in place is quite important. That NQF is about systemic change, so it's about bringing change on a systemic level. Also make sure that, there's continuity, because if you have people that leave, they don't carry the institutional memory with them and so on. The important thing is always to involve key stakeholders, because without the key stakeholders, you will not proceed. And in some cases, you need to provide leadership because some of the decisions that needs to be taken, is difficult. You must also understand the purposes for developing an NQF in your context. Be clear about that. And I think David spoke about that this morning, so I'm not going to belabor the point. Contexts differ. You need to be very clear about why you're doing it so that you can make sure that you set up the right processes in terms of dealing with that. Is it descriptive? Is it transformational? And is it sectoral or is it national? You must make up your mind. You must also understand the limitations of NQFs. It's not the panacea. It's not going to solve all your problems tomorrow. The other point I think which is important is to take intellectual scrutiny very, very seriously. So make sure that you reflect consistently on what you do, on your own processes, conduct research, publish findings, engage with a number of people, build a defensible conceptual basis, for what it is that you are doing. Active stakeholder and role player participation is important. And you would see, we've said consult enough. And I heard people were saying, yeah, but 6 years, you've started then, there's nothing that has happened. Sometimes it's good to let things simmer, as they say. Lesson 6. It's important to communicate and to advocate and to tell people what you are doing. One of the mistakes that we've made, we haven't adequately communicated the message of the NQF to the general public and also to the people who will be implementing the NQF. We've also learned recently how to use the social media. And I must say, on Twitter, there's quite a number of people that is tweeting about this seminar today. I'm sure you've checked it out. And events like this is quite important. We must also recognize the power shifts and the contestations. Okay? And it seems to me that universities are quite powerful here in Chile. But when there's a new government coming into being and so on, it's It's important to see where are things moving. Find reasonable solutions, we also said. The questions about non-formal and informal education is quite important, and there must be mechanisms that you can incorporate that. In our view, that learning is quite important, and so we need to encourage learning. And of course, the point is that one must consider the recognition of prior learning, because it is a terrible waste if people must learn the same things over and over and again. The NQF must work not for the people who implement it, but for the people, for the beneficiaries. Lesson 9, international networks and relationships are most helpful, and that is one of the reasons why I think it's important, for exchange, and one can learn from each other. I've learned a lot this morning just listening to you and listening to David speaking. Consider joint projects, because I think that is quite important. One of the things for me certainly is that I was delighted to hear that you've got a credit accumulation and transfer system, although some institutions are using it and so on. I would love to have that, and I got the book in Spanish. I must just brush up on my Spanish after this. Okay, then, concluding remarks. Increasingly, countries across the world are implementing NQFs. NQFs have got a lot to offer both developing and developed countries. NQFs development and implementation requires long-term commitment, intellectual leadership, and there must be sufficient funding, and there must be sufficient resources in the form of people and so on. Then lastly, just as a way of marketing, we are having an international conference on recognition of prior learning in Johannesburg next year. So if there's anybody around from the 23rd to the 26th of February, it will be useful to see you there. Thank you very much.